Why don't we just open with a word of prayer? We'll open with an Our Father. So why don't you join me, and then we'll get ready to take off. So in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, thanks for joining me. We've got just, I'm going to watch, I'm watching my clock here, and I promise that we take off at 6:30, so I've got about 2 minutes left. Let me just acknowledge that, Assisi is almost everyone's favorite place who goes on a tour of Italy. In fact, when we were with the Lane Group 6 months ago, and we were on the plane coming home, it's so interesting as we're reflecting on the experience, because Rome is like drinking from a fire hose. There's just so much to see in Rome, so many places, so much information. And a little bit last week, some of you may have felt that. It's an information overload. It's just a lot to see and a lot to cover. Of course, it's Rome. It was the capital of the world for much of history. And so it's certainly the capital of the Catholic Church. Assisi is a small place, and it's a quiet place. And often when we take a pilgrimage, we go to Rome first, and then we go to Assisi. And so what happens is, after 4 or 5 days in Rome, where you're sort of overwhelmed by the sights and the sounds and the physicality of traveling around it, you get to Assisi after this bus ride, and it's a small and quiet and magical place. You'll see that tonight. And people have such fond memories of just being there, because it's almost like a respite after the intensity of Rome. But we're going to look at I'm going to use a lot of media tonight. I'll be switching back and forth, and I'm going to try to tell the story, because I want to do more than just show you pretty pictures of Assisi. I want to tell you the story of St. Francis and St. Clare, and I want to tell you why Assisi is important. And to tell that story, I'm going to be using a variety of not only photos, but historic art. Much of the historic art I'll show you tonight actually comes from Assisi. It's frescoes and paintings that are there, to try to tell the story of these two remarkable people and this remarkable place. And then we'll be looking at some video and Google Earth. So it's 6:30, and we're going to go. So here's how I'd like to begin. Welcome to Assisi. As I said, it's a magical place. It's an enchanting place. It's a charming place. Everybody who goes to Assisi puts it down on the list of the favorite places they've ever been to in their life. And I could do nothing for 90 minutes but just show you pretty pictures of Assisi, and you would just, it takes your breath away. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you 2 minutes of breathtaking imagery, and then we're going to set the breathtaking imagery aside, and we're going to get a little more specific about St. Francis and St. Clare and the time and place. But let's just get this sort of breathtaking moment out of the way, and see the magic of this place and the scenic nature of it. Assisi is on the top of Mount Subiasio, which is in the Apennine Mountains. And these are the Apennine Mountains. See the Basilica of St. Francis. Notice that it's Gothic with the flying buttresses and the more pointy. It's an early Gothic construction, built in 1228, 1230. The green roof that you see there is the Cathedral of San Rufino. It is the cathedral church in Assisi for the bishop. This is the castle that sits on the top of Mount Subiasio. There you see the central piazza of the town. We'll be going into all of these places tonight. I'll take you through them all. And here you see the Basilica of St. Clare, another Gothic cathedral. Used to be the parish church of San Giorgio. We'll be going in there. Stunning view of the Apennine Mountains behind it. The Apennines are a chain of mountains that runs vertically through the boot of Italy, sort of the spine. And one of the things that's immediately obvious is how vertical this town is. It's built on a steep slope. It's a lot like San Francisco, where the streets are so steep, it's so vertical. One house just rises above the other. And to the point that somebody made about walking through it, it is a little bit of a hike up and down the streets. And here you see the Spoleto Valley, and off in the distance you see the Church of Our Lady of the Angels, or Ucula, and the Spoleto Valley, which we'll be talking about tonight. And by the way, it's all incredibly beautiful at night as well. So that is the beauty of Assisi. Let's now take a look at, let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing here and what it means. And I'm going to start off by giving you a little background and context. And I understand that everybody has a sort of different level of interest in things like history and whatnot, but you can't understand St. Francis unless you understand his time and his place. He is a product of his time and his place. The impact he had was because he lived in a particular time and place. And I want you to understand that because it makes sense out of his story. So St. Francis lives in the Middle Ages, sort of the late Middle Ages. He was born in 1181. The Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years in Europe. They were the period after the fall of the Roman Empire and before the what we call the Renaissance, or the rise of the nation states. And the important thing to understand, and it becomes very important to St. Francis's story, is that Italy was not a country. In fact, Italy has never been a country until about 150 years ago, around the time of our Civil War. Italy was a place, it's a peninsula that had many different states on it. A little bit like we have Central America with Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and all these things. It's a place, it's not a country. And at the time of St. Francis, Italy is divided up between these various kingdoms, the kingdom of Genoa, the kingdom of Pisa, the Amalfi region, all these different, Venetia, all these different kingdoms that rule it, and they're constantly at war with each other. And that's important to St. Francis' story. Now, something that we need to understand about medieval society, and that is that medieval society was a remarkably stable place. You know, from watching movies, we might think of medieval society as barbaric and primitive, very far from the truth. In places like in this time and place, medieval society was remarkably structured, and it was structured around cities and city-states like this one. This is an example of a medieval city-state. This is actually Budapest, but from an old woodcut. But it was very structured, and everybody had a role, and everything had a place. And at the time of St. Francis, this sort of social order, this structure, had been going on for 700-800 years. It's hard to wrap our mind around that. I mean, it's been 800 years since St. Francis, but at the time of St. Francis, the medieval order had been going on for 800 years. And in this medieval order, the medievals talked to themselves all the time in their writings about how society had these three, what they called, not classes, they called them orders of society. There were sort of three components of society, and they worked together like three legs of a stool. And the way they described it in their books were that society was made up of those who prayed, those who fought, and those who worked. So those who prayed, which were the church, the clerics, the monks, the nuns, the priests, the bishops, the whole ecclesiastical structure, their job obviously was to pray, not only pray for, but provide the sacraments and spiritual care for the other two classes or the other two orders. Those who fought protected the other two orders. They protected those who prayed and those who worked. And those who worked, of course, fed the other two classes. And as long as these three classes were all working together and everyone sort of understood their role, everyone was fed, everyone was theoretically safe, at least within your city or your region, and everyone was spiritually cared for. And that system had, like I said, had worked for 700-800 years. Now, one of the ideals for the knightly class, those who fought, was an idea called chivalry. And you've probably seen this in the movies, but a central idea to chivalry was the love of a chivalric love, or the love of a knight for his lady. That a heroic knight wants to, and this was romanticized in all of their writings and their songs. And what it was is that a noble knight has a chaste love to serve his lady and to lay his life down in service to a lady. Now, why am I telling you this? Because this is very, very important to the story of St. Francis of Assisi. And I'll just give you a little bit of a preview. He is somebody who longs to be a knight, and he loves the stories of courtly love, and he longs to be a knight in service to a lady. When God takes his life in another direction, he redirects that energy that he has and those ideals to serve a different lady. Obviously not a human lady. Now, into those three orders that have been going on for 800 years, at the time of St. Francis, literally right around his generation or a generation before that, this massive disruption had come. And the massive disruption was that a fourth order had come into existence. Remember, we talked about the three legs of a stool that are balanced. Well, there, in addition to those who prayed and those who fought and those who worked, now came there this other fourth order. And there were those who made money, those who traded, those who imported and exported and financed, those who did business. What had happened was the rise of a merchant class. And the merchant class in the Middle Ages and in places like Assisi in Italy was emerging, and what they made their money in is not only making things and selling things, but in transporting things. So it's import, export across regions and across Europe and across the Mediterranean. And particularly, just like a lot of companies do today, they made money not only importing, exporting, but financing that with banking and finance. And they became immensely rich, this sort of merchant trade class. And it was terribly disruptive, because how does that fit into the concept of the three orders? Who are these people? And the other orders didn't trust them. They didn't fit neatly into their categories. And in fact, the merchant class, those who made money, were urban elites in a sense. They lived in cities. They depended on cities because cities is where they made their money. And this conflict, this disruptive conflict, it began to brew in medieval society. And it actually, became, extreme, because in a lot of cases, the merchant class, this new wealthy, really they were the emergence of capitalists and capitalism. And what happened is they became the wealthiest and most powerful people in many of these cities. The landed gentry, the knightly class, was often cash poor. They had lands and they had titles, but they didn't have much cash because all they really oversaw was these agricultural estates. The church depended on these people because they could finance the church's programs and needs. And so what happened is, in many of these cities, the wealthy merchant import-export neo-capitalist market economy class became the most powerful class, and they became really urban elites. It's a lot like what we might be going through today when we look at people like tech billionaires, the Google guys, the Facebook people, the Apple and Microsoft people, or we look at hedge fund traders, the people who are making money, in finance, making billions of dollars, and they become resented by the other classes. The other classes need them because they need their money, but they resent them. And this boils over in medieval society, especially in Italy, with the emergence of two large political factions and cultural factions called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And for about 200 years, these two political parties, if you would, and that's really kind of what they were, like political parties, literally fought war after conflict in all of those regions and cities of Italy. The Guelphs represented the traditional three orders. They represented the traditional structure of society. The Ghibellines represented the urban elite class, the urbanistas. They had a very different economy, a very different set of values, a very different set of needs, and they were in such tension. You know, and part of it was, I mean, the analogy that I would draw is very close to today, where we're a divided society between whatever you want to call it, our conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans, red states and blue states. And it was like that. I mean, to some degree, it was like red and blue, Guelph or Ghibelline, Democrat, Republican. These people disliked each other, not just at the level of the politics, but down to cultural levels, because they really represented two visions of society and two worldviews of life. The sort of old traditional order based in the countryside with manors and estates and the three legs of the stool, and this wealthy, powerful urban elite class that could basically buy what they wanted and were building these cities and urban centers. Now, why am I telling you all this? Well, the church became torn between these two factions. On the one hand, the church needed the money and support of the Ghibellines in terms of finance, but they needed the protection and the stability of the Guelphs. And so each pope that was coming along during this time is torn. Just like today, the church was sort of torn between these competing worldviews, competing ideologies. You could identify whether it was priests or bishops or abbots, whether they leaned Guelph or leaned Ghibelline, like we might say in the Catholic Church today. They lean conservative, they lean liberal or Republican or Democrat, and they were just tearing each other apart. And nobody could find a way forward for the church. And I'm sharing this because what's interesting is that St. Francis of Assisi made such an impact on his society and for the last 800 years because he found a third way, not the Guelph way and not the Ghibelline way. He found a third way out. And that third way was radical personal devotion to Jesus Christ that caused a renewal to the church. Neither Guelph nor Ghibelline, but Christ. So let's talk about this young man and his friend, Clare. So first thing to know is that St. Francis's name wasn't Francis. His name was actually Giovanni di Pietro di Bernardone. Giovanni is Italian for John. So it's actually, his name was John, son of Pietro of Bernardone. Bernardone is the family name. How did he get the name Francesco, which would be how you would say it in Italian? Well, his father was a wealthy trader, one of those wealthy urban elites. His father was in the import-export business. He was set up in the city of Assisi, an old Roman city, and he imported and exported cloth and textiles between Italy and France. And his father, Pietro, traveled back and forth to southern France, the region of Provence, often every couple of months to do business. And his father, because he was making so much money based on his French trade, began to fall in love with all things French, much like today if we travel back and forth to do business in a certain place, we kind of become enamored with that place and its culture. And so his father began to buy things in France, French souvenirs and furniture for the house and clothes. And he brought back the songs and books from France. And he decided to nickname his son, Giovanni, Francesco, which basically in Italian means Frenchy, little Frenchman. It would be like you could call your kid Frenchie because you love all things French. And the nickname Francesco or Frenchie stuck with Giovanni or John. And of course in English, that became San Francesco di Assisi. or Saint Francis. He's also known in history as Il Poverello. Il Poverello, in Italian, the little poor man. He was the little poor man who changed the world because he began by changing himself. His friend and companion, that's the next slide here. His friend and companion was Chiara. And well, let's say a little bit more about Francis before we get to that. So this side here, this would be someone much like, this isn't a portrait of Pietro Bernardone, his father, but someone like that, a wealthy, prosperous, urban elite merchant, import-export businessman. And here would be his son, with the wealthy son of a wealthy man, a man about town, and Francesco grows up as basically a spoiled rich kid. He is fun-loving. He's a party guy. He's known in the town as the guy who calls all the other youths together. And he throws parties. He spends his dad's money freely. He loves the stories of France, and he loves the troubadour songs, genre songs, the songs of knightly and courtly love. He learns to sing them. He sings them in French. He's known among his friends. It's kind of like the rock and roll of his day. And he wastes and spends his dad's money. By the way, notice real quickly how bright all the clothes are. Another thing that's wrong in most Hollywood movies about the Middle Ages is that everybody's in drab clothes. The Middle Ages were very colorful. And Pietro Bernardone in the import-export textile business makes so much money because people in those days craved these bright colors and rich fabrics. And so Francis is known for wearing exquisitely colorful silk clothes, very fine clothing, and being this party guy around town. When he's a teenager, the Guelph Ghibelline thing blows up in Assisi, and the Guelphs in Assisi have to flee to nearby Perugia, 12 miles away, to hide out. So civil war is taking place all around him, this kind of red-blue, Guelph Ghibelline, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal. It's a time of just enormous conflict and civil war. Now, Chiara Affroduccio is from the other order. Her father is a count, actually, the landed gentry. So Francesco's father is this wealthy merchant class guy. Chiara's father, her family comes from those who fight. Her father is a count. Her brothers are knights, and they're land rich and title rich, but cash poor. She's also, for the record, 12 years younger than St. Francis. And there have been a lot of horrible Hollywood movies that portray them as love interests, like that brother, son, sister, moon movie where they're kind of like hippie flower children running around in love. Nothing could be further than the truth. She was 12 years younger than Francesco. And to the degree that they had a very close relationship, but it was more like he was her spiritual father, and she was like a spiritual daughter to him. Chiara is the Italian name that comes down through French as Clare. And just as an aside, Sinclair would be Saint Clare or Santa Chiara in French, which comes to Scotland and becomes Clan Sinclair. So if you've ever heard the name Sinclair, that's actually a derivative of Saint Clare, which is how it comes to us in English. By the way, I am going to, for the first half tonight, call them Francesco and Chiara until their conversions, after which I'll start calling them St. Francis and Clare. But I love the names Francesco and Chiara. And when you go to Italy, everything actually doesn't say St. Francis and St. Clare. It says San Francesco and Santa Chiara. So let's now take a look at some pictures of the streets of Assisi to get a sense for what this looks like. So when you approach Assisi, as I showed you in that video, it's so dramatic as you approach the city. You park down below, and as you begin to head up through it, you have these stunning views as you kind of approach. Here's pilgrims, since we're on a virtual pilgrimage. You can see the pilgrims coming up here from the parking lot. And you come into the piazza, this big flat space in front of the Basilica of San Francesco, and that's prepared for pilgrims. And as you approach it, you see just how stunning it is. It's physically smaller than some of the great papal basilicas that we saw in Rome last week, but it's stunning in its own way because of its verticalness. And also, if you're an architecture geek like me, which probably most of you aren't, you'll notice it's an early Gothic style, not like the Romanesque styles that we saw there. And again, everything in Assisi is vertical. You climb these steps. To the person who was asking about handicap access, Rome, places like the Vatican have ramps and elevators. Assisi is a very vertical space. And when you come up to the front entrance of the basilica, this is what you see, and we'll go inside in a little bit. The streets of Assisi, though, are, as I've made the point several times, so vertical. You can see down here somebody walking, and then just the next street up there, they're 20 feet over your head. So it's just a stunning place for that. Here again is another sense of the verticalness of the city and how the streets switch back through it. Everywhere there are stairs, but that verticalness is pretty. In fact, here's our lane pilgrimage group from 6 months ago when we were there. And some of you are on the call, so say hi to yourselves. And it was quite a day hiking up and down those stairs and through those switchbacks. Beautiful stairwells and little alleys everywhere. Today, some of them have art galleries in them. One of my favorite pictures. This is a very typical thing that you'll see there, just all of these little kind of courtyards and stairwells that move between the switchbacks. Every time I go to Assisi, and I've been there a number of times and stayed there for some lengths of time, I always stop at this staircase because I think this is a magical place and it sort of epitomizes the beauty. Again, the sort of vertical nature of the entire place. This is actually 2 years ago when I was there with my daughter. We actually rented an apartment for a week, and this was our apartment, 2-bedroom apartment. Everything there is just charming and wonderful and beautiful. And you get these amazing sort of narrow twisting streets. Actually, I got caught in this one with a rental car once trying to drive down it. It got so narrow, I had to back up through the switchbacks in a rental car. It was quite traumatic. And eventually, also, so that you never forget where you are, you see these kinds of little shrines everywhere. Here's obviously the Blessed Virgin in San Francesco and Chiara. Eventually, you come into the main piazza in the center of town. Wonderful and charming place where you can obviously get something to eat and shop through the lovely shops. This is what it looks like in January, if you're curious. This is actually an old Roman temple from when this city was a Roman city, converted later, of course, to a parish church. And lovely shopping in Assisi. In addition to everything else on your pilgrimage, there's wonderful opportunities to eat and drink, including gelato shops everywhere. And a few people on this webinar have visited all of those and been in that particular one. And lovely handcrafted goods. This is a remarkable wood carving shop with you can bring home some or ship home some remarkable things. So that brings me to the first pause I'm going to take and take some questions from you. So we'll just kind of take a break here and take any questions that you have up to this point.
Lay down.
I just unmuted everyone, so if you have a question, this is a great time to ask it. Everyone should be unmuted.
How big was your car, Greg?
It was a smart car. It was one of those itsy bitsy, it was about the size of a golf cart. And I started down the switchbacks And it started out like the street was like 14 feet wide, and then it went to 12, and then 10, and finally it got so narrow as I came around this one switchback that the smart car, the street narrowed to an alley, and then I had to back it up 3 or 4 switchbacks and got myself out. And then I had to go back to our apartment that I showed you there and open a bottle of Umbrian wine to calm my nerves.
The picture of Saint Francis that you had several slides ago, if I'm remembering his biography, isn't that what they think is his closest likeness?
Yeah, absolutely. The one that I showed earlier is the one that they believe is probably the closest likeness. Yeah, painted not long after his death. We'll see some more pictures of him here. I'll show you a lot more pictures of him. Okay, let's move on, and let me show you now. Let's do this. Let's give some context and locate all of this.
Greg, give me 1 second. I'm going to mute everyone, but it also mutes you until I unmute you. So
Okay.
give me like 2 seconds to get everyone set, including you.
2000.
Good to go.
Okay, so let's just give a little bit of context to where all this is, and St. Francis.
Down now.
This is obviously Italy, the boot, and I'm muted.
Oh, there you go. You're good.
Okay, so let's come in. Again, these are the Apennine Mountains that run through central Italy, sort of like a spine. Here's Rome. Here's Assisi. It takes about 2 hours in a car or so, or a bus to drive here on the highway. And as we come in on Assisi, I'm going to actually back up a little bit and give you some context. This is the Spoleto Valley. So this is the region of Umbria and the province of Perugia. In Italy, regions are kind of like states, and provinces are kind of like counties, and then communes are kind of like municipalities. And so this is the Umbrian region. This is the Perugian, the province of Perugia, and it's oriented around this valley. These are the Apennines here, and this is Assisi's arch rival, Perugia. And I'll explain in a moment that St. Francis actually spent a year as a prisoner of war here in a Peruvian dungeon. At the other end of the valley, the city of Spoleto. As we, let's tell that story, in fact. When Francis, when he's growing up, what he wants to do is he wants to be a soldier. He very much wants, he's enamored with stories of glory and war and honor. And in fact, his biographer, Thomas of Celano, most of everything I tell you tonight comes from a biography of St. Francis by Thomas of Celano, who was a companion of St. Francis and commissioned by the Pope to write a biography of him only 4 years after his death. And Thomas spoke to everybody who knew him. He had known Francis. Francis was a very enormous public figure, interviewed everybody, and has really good information. So I'm not really talking about some of the legends of St. Francis, but more about some of the true stories. When he's a young man, about 18 years old, he goes off to fight. He uses his father's money. His father equips him to fight in the army of Assisi against their arch rival Perugia. It's about 12, 14 miles across the valley. And you can imagine these two cities on these two hills constantly fight over this valley over the centuries. And in one of these battles that he goes off to and fights in, he gets captured. And he's taken as a prisoner of war to Perugia, where he spends a year in a dungeon. In fact, it's Thomas of Celano talks about how while he's in that dungeon, he cheers up his, he's constantly, he's a guy that everybody likes. I mean, Francis is so likable, and he's charming. And so he really takes care of the other prisoners. He cheers them up. He takes care of them. But it's a very traumatic experience, obviously, to be caught as a prisoner and held for a year in a dungeon. His father eventually ransoms him. There's some kind of a prisoner exchange. Perugia charges ransom. Pietro pays the ransom and gets Francis back. And And he comes back and he spends about a year. He's kind of broken by the experience and sort of not only broken, but dismayed because his dreams of glory. Thomas Achalana writes that he dreamed of filling his family home with honors and flags and glory. He's kind of a romantic young man, and his first experience as a warrior has been, obviously as a failure. And so after about a year of sort of moping around the house, he decides that he's going to enlist as a mercenary in the army of Innocent III, Pope Innocent III, who's raising a crusader army to go fight in a crusade. And so he, using his father's money as a war horse and an armor and weapons, he decides to set out to southern Italy to join the crusade as a mercenary. And he's riding this war horse with his weapons and his army down the Spoleto Valley to Spoleto, where he's going to then continue on. And as he's going, he hears the Lord speak in his heart. It's the way he describes it later. So imagine him riding that in that valley. He's got his weapons, his armor, his war horse, and he hears God say in his heart, Francesco, who can do more for you, the Lord or the servant? In other words, who can benefit you more, serving the rich man, the rich and powerful Lord, or somebody who is a subservient, to the Lord? And Francesco answers, he says, well, obviously the Lord, the bigger, more powerful, authoritative, wealthier person can do more for me than somebody who's beneath him. And then God says, then why do you leave the Lord to go serve a servant? Why would you leave the Lord, a rich Lord, to serve a poor man? In other words, why are you going off to fight this war and serve in some army under some general or even under a pope, when I, the Lord, own the cattle on 1,000 hills, right? I'm the Lord God. Why would you go serve somebody lesser than me? And Francesco says, well, Lord, what would you have me do? And God said, return home and you'll be told what to do. So at that point, Francesco turns around on that map I just showed you on his way to Spoleto, and he rides back to Perugia, to his father. And I want to share this. It's one of the most striking things that you'll see in Assisi. I'm lost. Hold on one second. I'm looking for my... Hold on one second. I've lost my capacity to share something important. Let's see. Please bear with me for just a moment while I get this working. There we go. You should see it now. So when Francis goes off to war, this is what he looks like. This is actually a drawing of the Crusader armies during his time. This is how they would have been dressed and equipped. These are actually the equipment that he would have had. In these kind of bright colors with his great war horse. And he sets off with all these dreams of being a great knight and a great warrior and winning glory. And he comes home in disgrace. And at the Basilica of San Francesco in Assisi, there is this statue that sits on the lawn looking down towards that. And this statue represents that time he rode home from war on the war horse and with the weapons and the armor his father had paid for, a failure as a warrior, coming back disgraced, having accomplished nothing, but waiting for the Lord to tell him what to do. So it's a very poignant thing, and this would be a great time for us to look now at the streets of Assisi and some of the landmarks in Assisi, because actually, yeah, let's do this. I apologize for misleading you here. Let's actually do this. I think this will be a more useful thing to do. Let's look at the landmarks in Assisi to give you just a sense of the place. We've seen some video and we've seen some pictures, but let's see some places that we're going to take a look at. This is the town of Assisi, and let me just kind of orient you to some things. This is the Bernardone home, where Pietro would have, or the Bernardone family lived. Actually, there's 2 houses here, and there was reconstruction. This is the central piazza. There's been some reconstruction over the centuries, and so there's actually archaeologists a little divided. His house seemed to sort of span these 2 locations here. It's not a very far distance. In fact, if we take our ruler, we can see that, that's only 45 yards. So the family complex seems to have been here. This is Chiesa Nuova. I'll show you some pictures of that in a second, what's called now. The Bernardone home here is where he was born, and I'll show you some pictures of his birthplace in a moment. He would have attended the parish school right here, San Giorgio, where the Basilica of Santa Chiara is now, would have been the parish school. And we'll be looking at that in a moment. This would have been the Cathedral of San Rufino, which is also very important because it was obviously the seat of the bishop. And here is the courtyard of the bishop that I'll show you in just a moment. We'll take a look at that. So now let's share back over here. And let's take a look at these specific places so you can see what they actually look like. So in this again is the central piazza, and the Bernardone home would have been right off that. It's actually off an alley right now when we go visit called Scaletta dello Spirito Santo, or the alley of the Holy Spirit, or the way of the Holy Spirit. And here we see the home of Pietro di Bernardone. And you descended down into this space where he was born. Now, there's 2 things I want to show you at the bottom of these stairs when we visit. And the first is the room where he was born. And there's a story about Francis's birth. It's kind of interesting. Apparently his mother was in labor and was overdue and was having labor pains for an extra day or 2 days or whatnot. And there was a holy woman in town who had been on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, had gone actually to Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and had come back from the site of the Nativity. And she advised her that you won't be able to give birth or complete labor in your rich apartment, your rich bedroom. You should go down to this basically area down here, which was used to be the stables, and try to have the baby down in the stables like Jesus. So Francesco's mother went down there and had the baby. So part of the legend of St. Francis is that he was born in a stable just like Christ. And this is birthplace of St. Francis. And when you come down in here, you see this little space, which would have been where he was born, in this stable space on straw. Right across from that is a little room where he was confined. So at a certain point, and I'll tell you more about that in a moment, his parents actually locked him up because they thought he was crazy. And I'll explain why his dad did that. Well, maybe this is a good time. What Francis started doing is when he started doing radical things to serve Christ, and particularly giving away his dad's money and his dad's inventory, his dad got so angry that his dad actually locked him up in this basement space right here. And this commemorates, this is the room where he was locked up. When his dad would leave town on business, his mother would let him out. And here in the courtyard, right outside that, you see his parents. Such an interesting thing, because this is Pietro, this is Pica, his mother. And when you come in, she's holding the chains because she would always let him out when the father went away on business. Pietro's looking away. He's that rich banker, wealthy man. And he was just exasperated with his son Francis, as I'll explain in a moment. Here is the Chapel of San Damiano, which I'll come back to in a moment. It's the small church outside town that eventually Francis heard this crucifix speak to him and say, "Francis, my church is falling in ruins, or my house is in ruins. Rebuild it." Now, here's what happens. Francis comes back from war, and he starts doing all kinds of weird things. So he starts giving away his father's money to beggars. He starts hugging lepers. He starts caring for all of these people. At one point, he meets a beggar and he changes his wealthy clothes for the beggar's habit and gives the beggar his horse. At another time, he meets and greets a leper and felt that if Christ loved lepers, he should too. At another point, he took some of his father's inventory, and this was the straw that broke the father's back. He took a bunch of his dad's inventory, and he rode off to a neighboring town where he sold his dad's inventory along with his horse, took the gold and walked back and gave it to the parish priest at San Damiano, the chapel, to rebuild it. And when he came back, his dad said, "Where's all my stuff?" And he said, "Well, I sold it and gave it away to this parish priest to rebuild his falling down church." His father was so angry because he'd been locking him up because of these incidents that his father decided to take him to trial with the local bishop. And this is the trial of St. Francis. So they went over to the bishop's courtyard that I showed you a moment ago, the bishop's house. And his father wanted the bishop to pronounce a judgment. It's basically a lawsuit. He wanted to have the bishop force his son to return or do restitution for the money. What Francis did was remarkable. Francis, in the presence of the bishop in the bishop's court, stripped naked, buck naked, to his birthday suit, handed his stack of clothes to his father, and said, "This is what you have given me. From now on, I renounce my birthright, and I renounce you as my father. I've given you back everything that you've given me." At that point, the bishop took his robe and threw it around Francis, indicating that Francis was now under the protection of the church. And when we go there, just a short distance off the piazza, we see this is the bishop's residence and his courtyard. And as we approach it, we see these plaques here that commemorate it. And inside this courtyard was where he was on trial, where he stripped his clothes and renounced his father and renounced his birthright. And he adopted a hermit's robe and wandered away happy, free from money, free from burden, free to enjoy a new life. Let's take a look now at what he did next. So after that, he becomes free of this, and he becomes this kind of strange figure who wanders around. Here's the parish church of San Damiano, or the small church of San Damiano, which we'll visit in a minute, just a short way down the hill. And he begins to rebuild it because the Lord and the crucifix had told him to rebuild the church. So one of the things that Francis begins to do is to wander around the town asking people for rocks. You know, it sounds weird, but he said, "Do you have any building materials? Do you have any stones or bricks or rocks that you aren't using?" And he would take them and he would carry them down this hill one at a time, and began to rebuilt the chapel of San Damiano, which was falling in ruins, because he understood what the Lord had told him to do was to rebuild San Damiano and other local churches. The other local church that he began to rebuild is this one here, the Porta Uncula. So this was another fallen chapel, and Porta Uncula is Latin for the little place or a little plot of land. And at that time, there was no city around it. It was just kind of a little swampy area out in the fields with this tiny rundown chapel. And Francis is gathering building materials, stones, wood, whatever he can find, and he's rebuilding this chapel and he's rebuilding this chapel, going back and forth. And he rebuilds the Porta Uncula, and it becomes really the center of his life from that point on. It is the place he most dearly loves. It is the center of Franciscanism and the center of his movement. And this is where, when brothers begin to gather around him, others gather around him and his followers, it is all centered here. Eventually, at one point, there are 5,000 followers of St. Francis camped in tents and in the open ground around the Portiuncula. Now, the Portiuncula still stands. In fact, and what's really fascinating is the, let's see, Portiuncula is, where am I going here? The Portiuncula is a small chapel that is now inside a very, very large basilica. So this is the Basilica of Our Lady of the Angels. And it is built over the top of the Portiuncula, this treasured location. And when you go there, of course, you see Franciscans. And as you enter the door, also, it is called Our Lady of the Angels. Let me see if I can show you this. At the top, you have this wonderful representation of Our Lady of the Angels. When we were there 6 months ago, we arrived in the evening and we basically stayed more or less right across the street from it. And we approached one evening, and at 9 o'clock, I think it's on Tuesday nights at 9 o'clock, they do a rosary. And thousands of local people gather to pray the rosary and sing the rosary and do a rosary procession inside the Portiuncula. And we were able to do that 6 months ago. And as an act of devotion, I'd like to share that with you. This is here, and I'll share that with you in just a moment. This is the Portiuncula inside of this massive basilica, and the rosary procession, which I'll share with you in a moment. Of course, it's on the street of Los Angeles, the Angels. There was like a military Veterans Day thing going on there last time we were there. It's also a papal basilica, which means it's basically papal property. And so you see the papal insignia here. And this is the coat of arms of it, which shows the Portiuncula inside. And when you come in, it is the strangest thing. It's this little chapel built inside this massive thing. But this is the original Portiuncula chapel, the home of Francis and his brothers, the home of their movement, the center of Franciscanism. It's just a small chapel. This is all it ever was. This, obviously, the basilica wasn't over it. It was in the open air. It was a simple place. And when you go inside, there's a few places to kneel and pray with these medieval frescoes on it. Just off to the side of it is this small structure, just a few yards away, called the Chapel of the Transit. The Chapel of the Transit is the place where St. Francis was laid to rest. When he came back to the Portiuncula and he was passing away, he actually asked to be laid out naked on the ground under the sky so that he could die a poor man with nothing. And then they brought him in here. It was a little hut. Inside, when you visit, this is actually the rope belt that St. Francis wore around his waist. And a beautiful fresco there that commemorates the passing of St. Francis, surrounded by his brothers, the transit. It sits right in the nave of the basilica. And in fact, when we were there 6 months ago, we had Mass, and the bishop actually celebrated the Mass for us, and we got to sit right here in front of the Portiuncula next to the Chapel of the Transit for Mass with the bishop. There's these amazing side chapels here. This is the icon of Mary that they carry in the procession that I'll share with you in a moment ago, that's brought out for the procession. And here is the nativity scene. What a lot of people don't realize is that St. Francis basically invented the idea of a nativity scene. What do I mean by that? Later in his, a few years later, when he was on a preaching crusade to local churches, he was at a small town in Perugia called Greccio. And it was Christmas Eve, and he wanted the gospel to come alive for people. So what he did was he gathered a sheep and made a little manger, and he got some animals, and he he put together basically the first manger scene at the front of a church, and he then basically preached the nativity story with visuals. And that was so striking because it helped the gospel and the story of the nativity to come alive. And of course, that is a tradition that's now come down to us, but it came from St. Francis. Here is a statue of him in the courtyard of the basilica, treasuring a small insect because he loved animals, of course. Here's Terry and Marilyn, who I think are on the call, but members of our group. And here's the famous story, I don't know if I'll have time to get to this tonight, of when he tamed the wolf of Gubbio, another famous incident. When you step outside the basilica there, you step on this walk. Pax et bonum in Latin means peace and goodness. It was kind of a motto for the Franciscans. It was a motto of Francis. And when you start up this brick road, this brick pathway leads about 1.5 miles directly up to the Basilica of St. Francis. So part of the pilgrimage experience is going back and forth between the Porta Uncula and the Basilica and the upper town of Assisi, walking this path. And we had the opportunity to do that while we were there.
Greg, Sandy
Yes.
Made a comment that she had a friend at the Basilica a few years ago, and they took part in the Rosary procession. And she said that her friend was amazed at the number of people and the various different languages.
So absolutely, it was the most remarkable thing. And I'd like to share that with you right now, because as an act of devotion for all of us here, because there's a virtual pilgrimage, I'd like to share the Rosary procession. It occurs at 9 o'clock, actually, by the time we actually did the procession outside. So you go inside the Basilica and you sing the Rosary with thousands of people standing over only. They do kind of a chant and response Rosary with the Franciscans. Thousands of people packed in there. And then afterwards you light candles and you process around the piazza and then come back to the Porta Uncula. So I'd like for all of us to just take a couple of moments here and experience what that was like virtually. Oh man, went away from me again. Hold on a second.
Yeah, as you're doing that, Sandy also mentioned that there was the great feeling of family that
Absolutely. I think you'll see that.
Experience doing it, even coming together from different languages, and that it was pretty
Oh, absolutely.
fantastic.
I think you'll see that here in this in what I'm about to show you.
Mater divine gratiae, nobis, Mater purissima, nobis, Mater castissima, nobis, Mater inviolata, nobis, consolatrix afflictorum, ora pro nobis, auxilium Christianorum, ora pro nobis, Regina Angelorum, ora pro nobis, Regina Patriarchalum, ora pro nobis, Regina Propria, Regina Virginum, ora
So I think you'll see that that was a very special thing. And just as Sandy was saying, it's the sense of family, the sense of community. That was really such a special moment. And I think for a lot of us that were there 6 months ago, that maybe was one of the highlights of the entire trip, was that remarkable procession moment. Let me just pause a second, take any other questions, and then we've got a lot more to share.
So Susan Wolf would like to know if you could share a little bit about the doves that gather at the church.
They gather that I don't know really more about that other than that they're there.
Susan, I can tell you that I have a friend who has visited Assisi a number of times, and that it's pretty miraculous, and that the birds seem to just gather, especially around the statues, and no one feeds them, and they just sort of keep coming back and hanging out in these lovely, beautiful places. But I think it is just like Greg is describing many of these experiences, just beautiful and miraculous and transcendent. And so I don't think there's a real explanation on that. I know that when we think of the Franciscans, we also think of nature and simplicity. And so I think it definitely goes along with that theme. But I don't think there's a real great explanation about it.
Okay, let me share. One of the things that is so I think hard for us to wrap our mind around St. Francis. Every time I've ever taught a class or anything about Francis, I always get this question: well, what? Because modern minds, we have a hard time wrapping I mean, did he have a political agenda? Did he? Did he advocate for some kind of political ideology or social justice ideology and this? And the thing that's remarkable about Francis is that he had no ideology. He was completely non-political. Never wrote anything political. Never spoke about anything political. Francis was focused on changing himself. He was focused on wanting to, as best as he could, authentically imitate Christ in his life and follow Christ. What Francis was saying is that how do you call yourself a follower of Jesus if you don't think like Jesus, act like Jesus, live like Jesus, walk, talk, behave like Jesus? Then in what possible sense can you be a follower of Jesus? And where this comes into such sharp, sort of break in Francis's life is after he's doing these, rebuilding the Portiuncula, he's doing these kinds of things, but he's doing them alone. He doesn't have any followers. Mm-hmm. And one day he's in the Portiuncula, and a little priest is in there in this little woodside chapel. There's probably 4 or 5 people at Mass. And the priest reads the gospel for the day. It was the Feast of St. Matthias, February 24 in 1208. And when he's at Mass, the gospel is Matthew 10, 9 and 10. And in that, Jesus tells the apostles, quote, "Take no gold or silver or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for laborers deserve their food." That's the gospel for the day. So he sends his apostles out and says, take nothing. Take no food, take no clothing, take no this, take no that, take no staff, take no money. Just go have an adventure. Just follow me. That's how he sends them out. And Francis says that day that he felt like that gospel was speaking directly to him. And at this point, he was wearing this kind of workman's clothing because he was doing all this rebuilding of San Damiano and the Portiuncula. And it's kind of like, in our kind of context, he'd be walking around in jeans and Carhartts. He's sort of in this sort of workman's clothing. But at that point, he strips that off and he takes the crudest garment that he can possibly find. It's basically like this kind of burlap poncho. And he takes his burlap poncho kind of thing and he wraps it around him, and he takes a piece of rope and he ties it around his waist, and he walks out with nothing, no staff, no sandals, no nothing, barefoot. And he feels like now he has liberated himself. He's really following Jesus. And this is the hardest thing for modern people, I think, to wrap their minds around us in our world, because all that stuff I talked about at the beginning about the Guelphs and the Gibelings and the emergence of capitalism. We also live in a time that's so divided, and we are kind of part of this market economy, and it's hard for us to understand. Was Francis trying to make a political statement about money? Was he trying to make a political statement or economic statement? But he wasn't. What Francis was saying is that when you have a lot of stuff, and by stuff, I mean your physical things, your money, a lot of your attachments in life, when you have all this stuff, you start to love that stuff more than God, and you stop being available to Christ. What Francis wanted to do was to free himself from anything that he might love more than God. And when you start having things and responsibility, all these other responsibilities, they come in the way of you being available to simply listen to Christ and be like him. So Francis, when he hears the gospel on the Feast of St. Matthias, February 24, 1208, and he strips off his workman's clothes, puts on the burlap outfit with the rope, and he walks out liberated. Now, remember at the beginning, I told you about this whole thing of how he loved the songs about chivalry and serving a lady, and then the knight lays down his life to serve a lady. This is the lady now. And let me show you the lady that he decides to serve. And you can find this in art in about 1,000 places. Now, where's my... excuse me, pardon me. I can't find my... Here we go. You all see St. Francis with a book and angels over his head? I'm hoping.
We don't see it yet, Greg. We just see the map and with the Portioncia.
Sorry, I'm having a little bit of difficulty getting this file to share. So let me keep talking about this while I get it to share. Here we go. Maybe this will work. Now you should.
There we go.
Okay. So he decides to love the gospel and love Christ, and what he does is he decides, and followers, as soon as he sheds all of his things and he begins to be completely free of things, people begin to show up and follow him. 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, priests, workers, wealthy people, farmers, they all begin to leave their things and come to be with him to be liberated. And what they do is, and this is a theme in Franciscan, in all of his writings, and a theme of the early Franciscans, is that he marries Lady Poverty. So if you take 5 minutes on Google, you can find 1,000 of these frescoes and paintings and pictures of St. Francis marrying Lady Poverty. So here you see the 3 commitments of poverty, chastity, and obedience. So all monks or religious take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. St. Francis is, of course, obedient to chastity and obedience, but he decides to marry Lady Poverty. And this is actually a thing. So there's all of this art where he marries Lady Poverty. So what he does is he takes that youthful passion for chivalric love, someone who lays down everything for lady, but now it's not for a human lady, it's for Lady Poverty. And so over and over again, he talks about marrying Lady Poverty. And why would you do that? I mean, why would you marry Lady Poverty? These are the Giotto frescoes in the Basilica that show Christ here performing. So here's Jesus officiating a wedding between Francis and Lady Poverty, with the angels and the saints gathered around. Why would you marry Lady Poverty? I mean, that we can't wrap our mind. Every time I teach a class on this, people say, what am I supposed to do? Quit my job, do this, do that, sell my house? Well, here's what they said. So this is from the Sacrum Commercium, Sacred Conversation of St. Francis with Lady Poverty. So medieval text. look, it tells a story. So it talks about Francis and his first brothers, and it says, while they were hastening to the heights of the mountain to behold they behold Lady Poverty standing at the top of the mountain. And seeing them climb with such strength, almost flying up the mountain, Lady Poverty is quite astonished. She says, it's a long time since I saw and watched people so free of all burdens. See, you can go anywhere and do anything and accomplish things if you're not burdened. And that was the genius of Francis, is that he could do anything for God because he wasn't burdened by things and all the things that come with things. And so Lady Poverty greeted them with such rich blessings. Tell me, brothers, what is the reason for your coming here, and why do you come so quickly from the valley of sorrows to the mountain of light? And the early Franciscans answered, we wish to become servants of the Lord of hosts, because he is the King of glory. So kneeling at your feet, we humbly beg you to agree to live with us and be our way to the King of glory, as you were when the dawn from on high came to visit those who sit in darkness and the shadow of death. And so it's this whole idea that when you set yourself free, you're truly free. Francis didn't have a political program. He just wanted to be free to serve Jesus as absolutely as he could. And that's why people began to gather around Francis, because they saw the lightness and the freedom and the joy. He's always described as laughing and likable. He had so much joy because he didn't have these attachments. So let me just stop there, and I'm going to just share let me share one other thing before we go on. About this time, he decides to go to Rome and ask the Pope, because at this point he's only got like a dozen followers or so. And so he decides to go to Rome and ask the Pope for permission to found a monastic order. And he gets there, and I think I showed you last time, there's this statue outside the Lateran Palace, the St. John Lateran, where the Pope was, of St. Francis and his followers across the street, basically. And they're kept outside for days or weeks, because it was about as easy to get an appointment with the Pope then as it is to get an appointment now with Pope Innocent III. You can't get in. Eventually, the Bishop of Assisi talks to a cardinal, and the cardinal becomes sort of a supporter of Francis, and he gets permission for Francis to go in front of the Pope, Innocent III. And he comes in, he's all kind of smelly and dirty, and he's in this burlap thing with barefoot, with a rope tied around him, and his followers are, similar. And the Pope sees them, and the one thing that he notices, they have tonsures or monastic haircuts. And the Pope is pleased, because they're not trying to overturn the church. They're trying to be good monks or good friars. But they ask the Pope to form an order. And they want to form a monastic order that doesn't have monasteries. They want to be free to embrace poverty. And they don't want to and they want to be able to free to travel abroad and simply serve Jesus. And this is a very unconventional request, because most monastic orders had structure, and they want to have this completely unstructured life. But here's what they didn't realize, is that a few nights before, this is the Pope here, Pope Innocent III had a dream. And in his dream, he saw an il poverello, a little poor man, holding up St. John Lateran, the Lateran Palace. So in his dream, the Lateran Palace, the center of the papacy, was collapsing, but it would be held up by an il poverello, a little poor man. And when Francis comes before the Pope recognizes him, in essence, from his dream, and he grants Francis and the first Franciscans a charter to form the orders of Friar Minor. This is the frescoes in the Basilica of St. Francis on the wall that tell the story. Here he is in the chapel of San Damiano, praying to the crucifix. Here he is surrendering his clothes and rejecting his father. And here he is holding the Pope's dream. And it tells this amazing story where the Pope gets behind him and lets him form the Orders of Friar Minor, the OFM, if you see that after somebody's name. And he wanted to be the friars minor, the little friars, the smallest monks, the most humble people with nothing. And After this, he tries a couple of times to reach to reach Muslim territory. This is another misunderstanding. He wasn't going to Muslim territory to start interfaith dialogue. Thomas of Celano is very clear why he was going to Muslim territory. He went there to convert the Muslims to the gospel, and he was willing and eager to be martyred in the service of spreading the gospel. But he tries a couple times to get to Syria and gets turned back by storms.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
A question from one of our attendees.
Sure.
They want to know, so is Francis a deacon at this point? And then how is he getting an appointment with the Pope as a deacon?
Well, he wasn't a deacon at this point. Well, he may have been made a deacon at this point. He got an appointment with the Pope because there was a Cardinal Ubalino, who basically began to believe in Francis's cause, and he exercised his influence to get in front of the Pope and get Francis an appointment. And when he comes in to the papal court there, everybody is like, "Who are these dirty guys?" And it was at that point that Pope Innocent said, "I recognize him from my dream," as the little poor man who was holding up the church so it wouldn't collapse. And it was that cardinal, and I'll kind of skip forward to the end a little bit, that Cardinal Ubalino, eventually becomes Pope himself, becomes Pope Gregory IX. And as Pope Gregory IX, he's the one who canonizes Francis only 18 months after his death, the fastest canonization ever, I think. 18 months after Francis dies, Gregory IX, the cardinal who supported him, canonizes him and builds the basilica. Any other questions? We haven't talked much about Chiara, so let's talk a little bit about Chiara for a moment. Chiara is such a fascinating figure. Let me see if I can show you a picture of Chiara, or some pictures of Chiara. And let's talk about Chiara for a second. Here. So Chiara is 12 years younger than Francis. And when she's 18 years old, so Francis is 30, they were not a love interest. They weren't boyfriend, girlfriend. She was a young girl. She had heard Francis preach at the parish church at San Giorgio during Lent. And she was so struck by his preaching that she wanted to follow his way of life. And on Palm Sunday, when she was 18 years old, she received her palm from the bishop, and then she walked out of the door of her parents' house, walked down to the Porta Uncula, and came to Francis and asked to to join the way of life that he was starting. And she took off her wealthy clothes, coming from this wealthy noble family, stripped her jewels and her wealthy clothes, put on a simple burlap kind of habit, like the Franciscans, and Francis cut her hair, which is a sign that she had been entered the monastery. And 16 days later, her sister joined her. Now, the father was furious. The count was just absolutely furious. And so Francis actually hid Chiara and her sister Agnes in a Benedictine convent up on Mount Subiasso so that the father couldn't find them. Eventually, the father did track them down, and he went into the convent to drag the girls home, her father and brothers. And Chiara clung to the altar and refused to let him drag her out. And then she pulled back her habit or her head covering and revealed her shorn hair and said, "I've been given to the Lord." Chiara lived such a fascinating life. After that, Francis gives her and a few of her lady followers, her sister and others, the chapel at San Damiano to be their residence. And they form something called, she becomes the first abbess, the head of the sisters there. Francis appoints her that. And they become known as the Poor Women of San Damiano. That was their first name. They were and that's all. It was a descriptive. They were simply the poor women of San Damiano. They lived there in abject poverty and simplicity in prayer. And the only occupation they had other than prayer and extreme fasting and extreme ascetic purposes was that they made altar cloths. This was their one gift. Because one thing about St. Francis is that we have very few of his writings survive, but what few writings we have of his are almost all letters that he wrote. And again, today Francis becomes a figure attached to a lot of different movements and ideologies. What he was really passionate about was the Eucharist. And the letters we have is him writing to parish priests or bishops, upset that altars and Eucharistic vessels and Eucharistic cloths are not being maintained in due reverence to the real presence. And he's very incensed about that because the real presence of Christ matters to him. I mean, he lives this radically simple life, but the Eucharist matters. And so one of the things that Clare and the poor women of San Damiano do is they make altar cloths. And that lasts until the present day because their order eventually becomes known as the Poor Clares. And the Poor Clares, actually, one of the most famous recent member of the Poor Clare order was Mother Angelica, the founder of EWTN, of all things. Mother Angelica was a Poor Clare. Just another little connection to that is, of all things, St. Clare is the patron saint of television. You may think, well, how do you become the patron saint of television? Well, it's this. She, when she was down at the Chapel of San Damiano and she would be too ill to walk up the hill to Mass, she would, and here she is receiving her habit from Francis, and here she is with her poor women of San Damiano. And they're always portrayed together as sort of dual servants of this movement. When she would be too ill to walk up the hill to Mass, she would miraculously see the Mass sort of taking place on the wall of her room. And she would even be able to tell people afterwards, so-and-so was there, they were wearing a blue coat, whatever, what the homily was. And so when television was invented, the Pope Pius XII made her the patron saint of television because of her capacity to see the Mass that way. I think it's time for us to see now San Damiano, this remarkable place that I keep talking about. While I get it queued up, are there any questions? So San Damiano is this small chapel where Francis, of course, heard the crucifix speak to him. And when you go there today, it's about a short walk down and out of the city, and you come to the end of Assisi, and you see this pathway. And our virtual pilgrimage here will take a sort of path down it. It's a remarkable walk. You see the valley spread out below, and these are olive trees. You walk through this beautiful, beautiful olive grove. Here's our pilgrim group. Past farmhouses, little rest stops along the way. And eventually, of course, it's a sacred space, and you're warned to be quiet and respectful. Eventually, you come here to this. And real quickly, I want to point out there's two statues that are right here. This is St. Clare, or Chiara, and Francesco. There's a statue of Francesco. Here he is carrying the rocks up and down to rebuild San Damiano up and down that hill. But Chiara is here, and something very interesting about Chiara. In all art that you'll see, medieval art or even today's art of Chiara, you'll always see her with a monstrance with the Blessed Sacrament in it. And there's a reason why. Years later, when she and her sisters, the Poor Clares, or the Poor Women of San Damiano, were living there, this is in 1240, an army of Saracens, actually an army under the German emperor with Saracen mercenaries, Muslim mercenaries, were marching up the hill to sack Assisi. And they were coming right up the hill through those olive groves that I just showed you. And the poor women in there, of course, had no defense. They were terrified. And she told them to have no fear. The Lord would protect. And she took a host of the Blessed Sacrament and a monstrance, and she walked outside and stood on this spot looking down that slope through those olive groves and held it up before the invading armies. And when they saw her and they saw the Blessed Sacrament, they turned aside and marched away. And so Santa Chiara is always portrayed with a holding a monstrance. I'm getting stuck here. There we go. When you go into San Damiano, you'll see, of course, once again, Franciscans. And this complex is what has grown up sort of around it. The original little chapel that's inside, again, what a beautiful place. This is the original chapel of San Damiano that Francis rebuilt, and where the crucifix that spoke to him was. And this was the chapel for Clare and her sisters. Of course, around it was built sort of a convent for them, and this is the cloister in the center of that convent. But they lived a very simple and austere life. This is their rectory, where they would assemble for their meals, sitting on a bench. And this is their dormitory. They never had beds. They simply laid down on blankets or mats on the floor, straw mats. And this is how they lived. And over here, they fasted. In fact, they fasted so much, the rectory is kind of ironic. St. Clare and her sisters would go for a fast for so long that Francis had to order them to eat every third day. In the corner here, when you see this cross, this is the spot where Chiara passed. Eventually, just lying on her mat, she passed in that spot. There's always a red rose and a flame kept there. Here she is with the monstrance, always portrayed in Catholic art with the monstrance. And here also, this is another important spot, is because it's here at San Damiano that Francis composed the Canticle of the Creatures, the famous prayer, Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon. And I've included that in your handout. And it was actually sitting in this garden right here that he made that composition. It's interesting that he made it, and when he made it, it means something different, I think, than a lot of people think. It's not necessarily nature love. What Francis is celebrating is that all of the creation points to God. Brother, sun, sister, moon, all of the elements of creation point to their creator. And he celebrates that. When he wrote it here, he was actually near the end of his life. He had received the stigmata on Laverna. I'll talk about that real briefly in a moment. We're running short on time, but he talked about he had received the stigmata. He was old and he was nearly blind. He had an eye disease, tuberculosis of the eye, kind of a terrible eye infection. And he had come back to sick and tired and old, or nearly blind, to San Damiano to be cared for by Chiara. And he sat out in the garden and he wrote the canticle to the creatures. When we were on pilgrimage there, we prayed the canticle of the creatures together in this spot. And if we have time here at the end, I'm going to come back here and let us pray that together. So while I queue up the next thing, if there's any other questions, I'd like to share a couple more things, and then we're going to look at the basilicas of Clare and Francis before we end, if there are any other questions at this time. So let's look at the next sort of remarkable incident in his life that occurred, and that is the stigmata. So near the end of his life, there was a mountain north of Assisi, a day or 3 days march, And he used to go up there to pray, long bouts of prayer. And while he was up there near the end of his life, he received the stigmata. It's a strange, strange story, but essentially Christ appeared to him. And it's represented in art so many different ways. And he saw the crucified Christ, and the crucified Christ transferred to Francis his wounds. So the nail holes in the palms and feet and side of Christ were transferred to Francis's body. He actually bore those. People saw them. They wrote about it. They were marks. They were sort of bloody marks on his body. They're called the stigmata. And this is an important point because Francis, in essence, has become sort of a living icon of Christ, a living icon who so perfectly imitates Christ's humility, Christ's love, Christ's simplicity, Christ's self-abandonment, that he actually begins to bear the marks of Christ in his body. But then after that is the time when he returns to San Damiano, and he's tired, he's sick, he's old. The stigmata where he was bleeding from his hands and his side and his feet were burden to him, joy but a burden. And that's when he composes the Canticle of the Creatures, which I want to conclude tonight by praying. So, but let's quickly look at the basilicas in the town while we have the moment. And I'm going to take you back to that because there are the two great basilicas in Assisi that commemorate Chiara and Francis. So let's go in those and see them. This is, as you come back into the town from San Damiano, you see here, you approach the Basilica of St. Clare. The flying buttresses, for those architecture geeks out there, indicate that it's a Gothic structure in the front. And when you come inside, again, a great early Gothic thing. But as you come downstairs, there's two things in the lower church. And the first is the tomb of Santa Chiara. Now, that's not her face. What that is a death mask. So she's not incorruptible. But what it is that it was a practice for the saints that you inter them and then you create this kind of death mask or sarcophagus over the body. So that would have been sort of represent her face, but her body is in here. And there you see the monstrance that she was fond of and that she warded the Saracens off with. Also downstairs in the basilica there is the cross of San Damiano, the original that spoke to Francis. It was moved up to the basilica after the basilica was built for safekeeping. It wasn't safe to keep it down in San Damiano because it was such a sacred relic. So what's down at San Damiano now is a reproduction. Walking to the other end of the town, we come to the Basilica of St. Francis, and you see again that wonderful statue that commemorates his return and disgrace as a warrior, his failure as a warrior, which only, of course, led to his success as a saint. And looking back up towards the town, we see the Franciscan Tau cross, shape of the Tau cross, Pax, peace, the pilgrim site, the cloister inside. We had Mass in a chapel just off here when we were there last time. Now, this is the upper church. There's actually kind of a layer cake of sort of 3 layers because that's such a vertical building. This is actually, that's the middle church. No, yeah, that's the upper church for the Giottos. The upper level church with these remarkable frescoes by Giotto that tell a story of St. Francis and his life. There's also a sort of lower church area. Also here's, I'm sorry, I put them out of order. This is the cross of San Damiano, which is in the chapel over at the Basilica of Santa Chiara. That is the original crucifix, the actual one that spoke to him.
Oh, Elizabeth has a question.
Yeah.
I've tried to unmute her, so let's see if she can come through.
Sure. That's Pope Benedict praying before it. Elizabeth, hello?
I'm not let's see. It appears, here we go. We're hitting the button, but perhaps, Elizabeth, you need to hit your own control for sound on your own computer, because it appears I'm not able to unmute you, perhaps due to your own computer.
Let me show us a few more images, and if Elizabeth can come through, then just let me know.
Okay.
This is sort of the middle tier of the basilica there. There's sort of an upper church and a sort of a middle church. And then when we come down to the bottom, there's a couple of remarkable things. And the first is this: there's a space down there that has the relics of St. Francis. I'd like to show you, these are the relics that I'm going to show you, actual relics, but these are the things that you see. You have his alb that he wore for when he was serving as a deacon. And that was made for him by St. Clare. You have remember the original poncho that I told you about, the thing that when he stripped off his workers' clothes? This is the original poncho, the original mantle of him that he wore, this kind of crude burlap garment with a rope around his waist. And this is the mantle of St. Clare, the tunic that she wore. This is his, that was the first one he wore. This is what he was wearing when he passed. This is the shoe, one of his shoes that was, when he had the stigmata, had blood in it. And you can see the marks of that. The hair of St. Clare is kept in here as a relic. A ball of thread that was spun by her, a cord, Francis's breviary, and then basically his rosary. And so let me show you, these are those objects. This is the original thing that he pulled on. This is what he wore when he was wearing when he died. This is the shoe that he wore with the stigmata, the hair of Santa Chiara, ball of yarn. This is his breviary. We prayed the office, the Liturgy of the Hours every day. He was a faithful churchman. And then downstairs in the basilica is his tomb. This is actually the tomb of St. Francis. He's buried in there. You can go down there and pray in the chapel and venerate his tomb. And when we come out at the end of the day, it's the most pretty, or most beautiful and sublime place that you'll ever see. Did that question come through, or does anyone have a question?
It doesn't appear that we're able to unmute Elizabeth for some reason. It must have to do with her computer at home, like not giving me the ability to do it.
Okay.
Because I'm hitting the button, but it's not working. Elizabeth, feel free, to type it in. She might, we have another question.
Okay.
Kathy wants to know, is this in the church at the Basilica?
What's that?
Kathy wants to know if that was in the church at the Basilica.
Which thing is she referring to?
I'm not sure. She didn't say that. She just said, is this? So Kathy, if you want to type me in exactly what you're asking, we can
chime in. Anybody else? Can you just group unmute everybody?
She said the alb and the relics.
Oh yeah, no, that's in the Basilica of St. Francis. So that's in the Basilica of San Francesco. That is down in the basement. You did see that, Kathy. You may not remember, but we were there. Any other questions? Okay. If there are no other questions, here's how I'd like to just sort of end tonight. I know that we're a couple of minutes over, but I'd just like to take a couple of moments and end by us praying the Canticle of the Creatures. Now, if you downloaded the handout, or you can pull the handout up in your browser window, then I'd like to pray. As we said, this was the spot where Francis was old and ill with the stigmata, worn out from all of his travels, nearly blind. In fact, right after he composed the canticle, the cure for his blindness was to cauterize his eyes. They got a hot piece of metal, got it white hot, and they just simply burned his eyeballs out right after he composed them here. And even in that state, this is the Canticle of the Creatures. And I'd like for us to end this evening by praying together. So I don't know if we can unmute everybody, Carla. If it's possible, it'd be great. If you can be unmuted and you have the handout with you, or you can pull it up, I'm going to just encourage you to read along with me. And that's how I'd like to end tonight, is by in the spot where he composed it, seeing what he saw, praying the Canticle of the Creatures. So let's do that together. Pray with me.
Okay.
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Most High, all-powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no man is worthy of praise. Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord, brother's Son, who brings the day, and you give light to him. And he is beautiful
all his splendor.
of you, Most High.
He bears the likeness.
Praise be you, my Lord, moon, and the stars
In heaven you formed them.
clear and precious.
Precious and beautiful.
Praise be you, my
You, my Lord, whose brother wind,
cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through which you gave sustenance.
to your creatures.
Praise be you, my Lord,
Lord,
Mr. Water,
your water,
which is very
very
useful.
useful and humble and precious as a taste.
Praise be you, my
You, my
Lord,
Lord, through brother fire,
through
whom
whom
you
you
light the night, and he is beautiful, faithful, and robust in his thoughts.
Praise be you, my
My
Lord,
Lord,
sister
through
mother,
sister Mother Earth,
who sustains
sustains us and governs us,
who produces
with
varied fruit.
fruits, with colored flowers and herbs.
Praise be you, my
You,
Lord,
my Lord,
those who
to those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation.
blessed are those who endure and
Pure indeed, for by you mercy they shall be crowned.
shall be crowned. Praise be you, my Lord,
My Lord, sister bodily death, for whom no living man can escape.
woe to those who
To those
die.
who die in mortal sin, blessed
Blessed are those who
death will
find
in your most holy will.
those
The death does to them no harm. Praise and
bless my
bless my Lord, and give
give
him
him
thanks,
thanks.
and serve him with great humility.
Praise and bless my Lord, and give him thanks, and serve him with great humility.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. And if you need to jump off, please feel free. But if you have a final question, I'm certainly willing to take it. Otherwise, we'll come to a close. And I hope that you'll enjoy coming with us to the Holy Land next week. And by the way, if you want to see Rome and Assisi, not just virtually, but in person, I am organizing their pilgrimage there next spring. That will be Lane. So let us know if you're interested, and we'll, as plans begin to take shape, we'll keep you in the loop.
Hey, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you.
Blessings to you all. God bless you.
Thank you.